I came because my family did. My dad was elected to be president of Bethel, and he was going to start in 1954 and have a year to start learning the ropes. We came in 1953, and so he was a pastor in Chicago before then. But that's what brought me here. I was 10 years old. I really wanted to go to Bethel. Now, some faculty kids just don't, but I had grown up breathing Bethel, so it just felt like someplace I really wanted to be a student. So that wasn't a big question for me. Plus, there was a tuition benefit that really made it almost imperative that I do that. I went into school not sure what I wanted to major in, but I knew I loved English, so I took a lot of English classes. And then I took German minor because I had taken a lot of German in high school too. And I loved German. And when I got to be a junior, I had to decide on what I was going to do with my life, get a major. So I decided, well, I'll stick with that English major and I'll come back after I graduate and do student teaching, because I could take my coursework before I graduated, but I had to come back for that last piece. So that's what I did, and then I taught for several years after college. I taught in Brooklyn Center High School out here north of town, and I was there for 3 years. I was there 2 years just getting my feet wet on teaching, and then my husband, who was my very good friend during college, but we hadn't dated much. We had dated a little bit. He was in Peace Corps for 2 years. When he came back, he went to seminary, and we started dating again. And so we got married just before his third year of seminary. So I finished my last year of teaching here to help support him on his way through the last year of seminary. And then we moved out to the East Coast, so everything changed for me at that point. I'll tell you my 8 roles at Bethel real quick. I was the daughter of the president. I was a college student. Then I was the wife of a seminarian, so I went to SemWives meetings. And then I was the wife of the campus pastor later, because he came back and became campus pastor for a number of years. And we did hosting of student groups like engaged couple seminars in our house and student missionaries in our house. And so I was very much involved with that. Then I was the parent of 3 students who came to Bethel, because all 3 of our boys came here. And then I was the wife of the associate vice president for seminary development. So sometimes I would go on donor visits with Jim, because I knew as many people as he did. So the development department got two for the price of one with us. Then I finally became an employee, because I took a job with the admissions office in the college, and I was what they called the systems manager, which meant I was in charge of everything except what the counselors did. All the paperwork, all of the timing of advertisements and brochures, and when to get all the recommendations in and the grade point averages in and get it ready for reading. So that was my bailiwick, and I oversaw quite a number of workers at the same time. So that was my only time to actually be an employee here, but it was for 1998 to 2004. And then my last role with Bethel has been to work with the History Center. And in 2008, Jim started working on writing books. And that's when he needed me to start helping with editing. And we decided that we were a good team in writing and editing. So we did 4 books together. And then when he passed away, he had been the chairman of the History Center committee, and so they asked me if I would take that on, since I knew as much as he did about that. And so I've been the chair since 2013 until this last spring, when I just retired about a month ago from that role. So those are my 8 roles at Bethel. When we first came to Bethel, I would say it was very much of a family feel here. It was a much smaller school. There were about 400 in the college and about 130 in the seminary, and there were 38 faculty members. And everybody went to everything for each other. Part of it was that they were all youngish, having families, and so they had a lot in common. But all the faculty families really were committed to the liberal arts idea, so that, the philosophy people would go to the ball games, and the history people would go to the plays and the concerts. We really supported each other, I think, in a very strong way. And they were also very committed to the idea of the Christian mind and making that a central part of their teaching, and also in how they viewed all the various parts of the academic life. So it's what you would expect with a Christian college, and they were really living it out. It was a wonderful time to be here because we knew everybody, and everybody knew everybody else. And you could get to know almost all of the students, too, over time, which can't happen now. So I would say that kind of lasted until the 70s. It was getting to be a big place then, but the same faculty members stuck around for a long time, many of them, and carried on that same ethos of we support the whole school, And then as they started retiring in the 80s and 90s, and the school kept growing, it just became more like you kept that family feel, but it became more your department and the people you worked with, and maybe some other areas that you really were interested in. But it was harder to be that family altogether. So I think that was the biggest change I saw. I have to tell you, before I tell you about the women, I want to tell you about my dad, because he was my main role model, he and my mom. And he had a strong respect for knowledgeable women. He didn't just, in his time, men were the thing, and you just kind of discounted women. But he had a coach in high school who was a debate and speech coach. And he just thought the world of her. She was very, very smart. And she took him and another fellow who became a debate team, and they won the national contest, NFL contest for National Forensics League, not football. And, and they became the national leaders. And it was all with her. He said it was all her doing. I think she had some good stuff to work with there. But and then he also was doing extemporaneous speech and got a national award in that. Came to college and got some more awards. So he had good startup, and he really said it was her doing that got him going in it. And he kept touch with her all her life. Once in a while, Mom and Dad and he would go out and visit her when she lived in the West Coast. So he really respected her. He respected Esther Sable. I mentioned her name to you before. She was a teacher in all 5 of the schools that Bethel had from 1914 to 1958. And she was probably the only woman for most of that time. And she was very bright. She could teach Greek. She could teach English. She could teach it all. She was very much into the Bible and missionary training course, which was another set of things too. And he just thought she was amazing. And again, they kept in touch long into her retirement and wrote letters when she was in a nursing home in Chicago. And then there was one other woman that he really thought a lot of, and that was Adolf Olson's wife. Her name was also Esther. After Adolf died, and he's the man who wrote the centenary history, so he knew a lot about Bethel's history, and they'd been at Bethel. He was a teacher starting in 1915. So she would call my dad, Esther would. She lived in a house near Bethel, and she said, I just baked bread, limpa, Swedish limpa, was wonderful. And she said, if you stop by on your way home, I'll give you a couple loaves for your family. And so he was always eager to get a little limpa, and he knew if he went to visit Esther, it would also involve coffee and a fairly long conversation. But she knew so much, and he just wanted to know what she knew. And she knew the Bethel history from personal. And because of Adolph's work, she had known all of that they had put in the book. And She said her dining table was books for years on end they could never entertain because it was covered with papers and books for her husband's work. But those three women, my dad was such a cheerleader for. He just thought the world of them. And then the other thing I want to mention is that my mom probably was my next strongest influence. And I think you may find that there are some other people name her as an influence in their lives as you go through this project. But for me, she was Mom. And she was 33 when they came here to take on the presidency. She had two little girls and my brother who was disabled from meningitis that gave him brain difficulties after that. And then they had one more child when they lived here. So her hands were really full. But every year they would sit down with a year-long calendar and they would say, we need to have the faculty in and we have to have student groups in and when are we going to do it? And she was always game. I look back at that and think, I would have cried, I think. And I think maybe sometimes she did. But they set up this amazing schedule for themselves. And she taught me that you can do big things if you take them in bite-sized pieces and figure out how you're going to do them. And that became a life lesson for my sisters and I. I think none of us would ever flinch at holding a party for 100 people, or maybe even 200 people, because it could be done. So this is my hats off to my mother. When I became a student, Effie Nelson was my advisor. She was a German teacher. She also became the Dean of Women, and she was a wonderful advisor. She was fun to talk to because she had this little witty sense of humor that kind of quietly snuck upon you. And then you suddenly thought, did she say that? I think she did. And so she was fun. Then when I went into English, there were three women teachers, Janine Bohlmeyer, Betty Jane Tutton, and later on Lorraine Idle. And they became kind of my first look at what a professional professor would be like, because they were serious about their work. They were very good at what they were doing, and they gave me a lot of respect for the field of English. Then when I went into education along with it, another woman was there by then, and her name was Dr. Jeanette Runbeck. And she was the first woman to have a doctorate, I think, at Bethel. And she had worked hard for that, and she was a tough teacher. And all of us who took class from her share stories sometimes about how she came down kind of hard on us and said, you're not doing your best work. I know you can do better. I know she did that for me a couple of times, and it was not fun, but it was true, and I tried to shape up more for her work. There were some people in not teaching roles, but other roles, like Eunice Peterson, who was the school nurse, and so many students would go to see her not just because they had some physical problem, but because they needed a counselor talk. They needed somebody to just listen. She always had the box of Kleenex next to the chair because some of us needed it. And two other people who just knew a lot, excuse me, were my dad's assistant, Florence Oman Johnson was her name when she finally did marry. And she was one who she was ahead of it all the time. She knew what he was going to need, knew what was going on the campus, especially on the college side. And then there was another woman named Edna Schultz, and she was, between her and her sister, who worked with the BGC conference headquarters, they kind of ran Bethel and the conference, because they were the people. She was a registrar for many years, and then she moved over to be dean of the seminary, or be assistant to the seminary dean. And she sat at an office outside of his office, and she kind of knew everything that was going on there too. So they were kind of like catalyst people who you could go to if you didn't think you should bother the dean. Edna would know, or Florence would know. So I guess I learned there that you don't have to have a title to be an important person. I knew that anyway because of the way my folks have treated people all along. You don't need to have a title to be considered really a worthy person. There were two women who came through the PE department. Marilyn Starr. She was starting when I was in college as a PE teacher. She eventually became Dean of Women, and then eventually she moved over to Baptist General Conference, and she ran their, what they called BGC Gold program, which was for older adults, for service projects and traveling and all kinds of things. And it was a nationwide program. She was a big personality gal. And the other PE person, some of you may know as Tricia Brownlee, because she's been here more recently. But she started in PE, and she ended up being, I believe she was associate academic dean by the time she finished. She was the one who, when I took my job at the admissions office, you have to go be interviewed to be sure that your theology and your lifestyle will fit at Bethel. And she was the one who got me. So she said I was okay to stay. So, but I have three more people to mention. One is Judy Mosman, and I think you're going to be talking to her later. Judy and I were classmates, and then we lived together for a year while we were teaching before we were married. And she came to Bethel in an employed capacity in the education department. She had been teaching in elementary, and she came to work with student teachers with Jeanette Runbeck. And then she was so talented that she got snapped up to be the alumni director for Bethel. And then she got snapped up to be the VP for student life. And she was in charge of the Dean of Women and the Dean of Men. And she was the first female to sit on the president's board, president's cabinet. So I saw her recently and I said, I think you were the first married woman with children who got hired as a full-time person here. I'm not totally sure about that, but it's my sense that she's very close to the beginning of that. Because up till now, everybody I've talked about is a single woman. Single women could do anything in the conference and in churches and at Bethel within reason. We had lots of missionaries who were single women who were out doing very frightening things around, 1910 in Thailand, by themselves. And then people like Esther Sable. So they were tough women. They could hold their own. But now we started having some married women. The other two that I just want to mention, and they were both married, but I think Elvira Michelson was one, and her husband was a professor of New Testament at the seminary, and she got involved with the whole thing that was coming up in the 70s and 80s was, what is the role of women, especially in the church? And there was a whole push like John Piper was having with the complementarian view on things. And Berkeley and Elvira were saying, we don't read it that way. We read that there is neither male nor female. And we read that women had responsibilities in the New Testament. And we are all gifted. And anyway, out of that came the Christians for Biblical Equality group. And Elvira just went around giving workshops. Berkeley died, and she had to kind of pick it up all on her own, and she was up to the task. And she got to be known internationally because this was a very new thing that was going on, and people all around the world Christians all around the world were wondering what's the right thing to do, and they were gathering their information. So I had a lot of respect for her and her mind. She had a wonderful mind, and her heart was in it, for the Lord, which is wonderful. And the other person who I respect so much is Jeanette Bakke, and she has continued to be a force for me to think about how you take a sharp mind and you really connect it to spiritual formation, which was her area of expertise, and she's done a lot of writing in spiritual direction and spiritual formation. And so those are the women I think of when I think of people who've been really important in my life, especially related to Bethel. There was the Dean of Women worked with the women students, and the dean of men worked with the male students. And the thinking was, of course, they have things they want to talk about that only another woman could know about or only another man could know about. Under Judy Mosman, in fact, we were talking about that last time we were together, she said it just went away. We decided we only need a dean of students to work with both men and women. And so that was the mid-'80s, I think, that somewhere in there that went away. I always felt very respected and welcome here as a woman. The fact that my dad was the president at one time maybe helped me a lot. I don't know, because people were generally, here's Carole Spickelmier, her father's the president, so that kind of thing. But I don't think so. I think most of the time people were kind and welcoming to the women as well as to the men. But you may find some other stories as you collect this information. I do know that wherever I've worked, because I worked at Augustana College in Sioux Falls, which is Norwegian Lutheran, but similar story to Bethel, salaries for women were very low, and here my salary was pretty low too. Part of that's just that's the educational world. I mean, you always struggle with that in a school. But I think it's also a leftover from when men were getting the paycheck. The thinking back in the 50s was we need to pay him enough to raise his family on. It's got to be enough for him and his wife and his 3 kids or whatever. And so that's how they would build a salary package. So when a single woman would come along, which most of them had been, they didn't think they needed to have as much money. And of course that changed when this more egalitarian thing came along and women were saying, hey, we're doing the same work as these guys. We should be getting paid the same. However, in terms of my salary, this was my view. My salary is not high. I maybe could fight for a little bit more. But I was a salaried person, not an hourly person. And I could always ask for other things, which is what I did. So I asked for flexibility of schedule because I had a husband who was a pastor and I had 3 kids. And so if I had a flexible schedule and my husband had a very important funeral that I really needed to be at, I could arrange that. Or if my kids were having something going on that I really needed to spend some time with them, I could do that. So I figured it was a trade-off. I took a lower salary, but I got a lot of flexibility. And it worked pretty well for me. Not having a president yet, it'll come. And we've got a provost now who's a woman. That's the next thing to a president. and there are other schools that have presidents, What you have to have for that is a person who's got the degrees they need and the background that they need. And we're a special school because we have a Christian outlook, and we want our president to have some other things like knowledge of the conference that we are owned by, and a general, not just a grudging acceptance of our lifestyle desires, but a gung-ho supporter of what Bethel is. And that's harder to find. I would point to the 1980s as the time when the tide changed for women. Up till then, almost all were single or had support roles. And after that, there were many women who were coming to apply for jobs. And at that point, they had had enough time. I'd say that my generation, many of them went on and got further degrees, and so they were ready to take on roles in a college or seminary that maybe the others hadn't really been quite prepared for. Well, I think maybe it was just kind of understood that married women with young children particularly wouldn't probably apply, because men and women all had that same assumption, I think, with a very few exceptions. There always are some exceptions. But I don't think there was anything ever in writing about not hiring a woman. So when I talk about being part of a church, my dad was a pastor, my husband was a pastor, I have a son who's a pastor, and I have now a daughter-in-law who's a pastor. So it mixes your roles up. So I tried to answer this. I think I have been looked to for leadership in all of those places. I think that I've been able to contribute. I have gifts in organization and in writing and in editing and in music and in teaching. Those are my areas, and all of them are usable in almost all of those places. I worked, when my children were little, I worked as an associate director of a school for teenage parents, and this was in the 70s when kids had to leave school if a girl got pregnant. So then they had to be tutored until their baby was delivered. And so the churches set up a wonderful little program where they could come to a building we had, and we'd have tutors, and we'd have someone to watch the baby once it had been born, and the pastors supported it, and the hospital medical people supported it, and that's my kind of tea. I take all that stuff and make some order out of it. So that was community and church, and I just have to give to whatever it is, what I have to offer. I think that's what it is. I live in a townhome association now, and I guess I try to be a person of goodwill. They know I'm a Christian. Sometimes they'll come and talk to me about Christian things. But everywhere you go, you are you. You're the only you there is. And so you just ask the Lord to help you know what you should be doing when you're going into conversations or going into new settings. Well, I think Bethel has been a wonderful place for a lot of people, and for many different reasons, and most of them have to do with other people that they met while they were here. So I think this project is good because it's going to surface some new names of people who have touched other people that are female. And I think it's going to be very encouraging to other women to know that they really are making a difference. Now, all along, even in my grandmother's generation, they knew they were making a difference. And the fun thing about Christian living is that power isn't the thing, and a name isn't the thing. In fact, you're to be a servant, So women have always had that role of serving others and taking direction and all of that stuff. And now that we're in a different spot in terms of some of us have power, how do we use that in a very Christian way, in a spiritual way? It's an extra little dimension. Men have dealt with that for a while, Christian men. Women are having to deal with it more now. Well, I hope they survive this financial time of trouble. So far, they're doing better than a lot of places that I've heard about. But I think God uses this winnowing time to shake out the extra stuff that maybe we didn't need, or just to say not now, later. But I'm hoping that it'll continue, but I hope it stays true to its mission. It's not worth continuing if it doesn't stay true to its mission.